I'll tell you briefly about the revolution before I go into my own involvement in this book and my life during that time. The revolution began in Ethiopia in 1974, and it started because of inflation, because people were frustrated with the situation in the country, because there was such a large disparity between the rich and the poor. If you were born rich in Ethiopia, you were born very, very, very rich. And if you're born poor, you're at levels of poverty that are devastating. And you do not move out of those. There was no sense of social mobility in Ethiopia. And people like you, and in fact people exactly your age, if you were 15, 16, 17, 18, those were the people in Ethiopia that started talking and saying, why are things like this? Why is it that I can be in school but my cousin is poor and they're not, or my neighbors? And high school students, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, some graduate students also started to have these same conversations. And if you can imagine Ethiopia in 1974, they have already heard about, through the news, they've heard about the civil rights movement in America. They have been paying attention to what happened in Cuba. They are kind of listening to what's going on in Argentina with the dirty wars. They are seeing all these movements around the world, very similar to the Arab Spring. And they're wondering, well, if people can make a change in these other countries, why can't we? Why can't we rise up? But in Ethiopia, it was a little bit different. Emperor Haile Selassie could trace his lineage, his monarchy, 3,000 years. That was the legend and the myth, and what he said was true. That he had a bloodline that he could trace back to King David and King Solomon in the Bible. So he was destined, he was chosen by God to rule this country. And his children who would come after him also had royal blood, holy blood. They were meant to rule. And Ethiopia is a really religious country, very, very religious. I was driving around Oklahoma and seeing all these different churches, and it's very similar in Ethiopia. We have churches everywhere. And people who are my parents' age, my grandparents' age, of course they go. But people who are your age go freely, and they go all the time, even now. They go, if there's a holiday, people drop what they do and they go to church. There's fasting. We're in fasting season right now. So Ethiopia in 74 was that way, plus more. It was a little bit, it hadn't quite modernized yet. But people said, why is he even ruling? They were starting to question. And they started having meetings. They started having secret meetings. And parents started getting worried. And if you guys know about when your parents get worried and they don't want you to go somewhere, and they may try to ground you, they may try to ban you from using the telephone. Same things were going on in Ethiopia, and children were sneaking out. But what was happening is that with the help of these college students, with the support of even college professors, they were being heard. They were actually starting to make a difference. And then pretty soon the military and the police started coming into some of these meetings and saying, you know what, we're going to support you. We do think this country needs a change. And if you have our support, if you have the support of the military and the police, what can Haile Selassie really do? So if you think about what was happening even just a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, Occupy Wall Street, have you guys heard about that in the news? And remember, it kind of started in New York, but all of a sudden we had to occupy Rome, and we had to occupy, Barcelona, and we had, was there an Occupy Oklahoma City? There was? Wow, okay. So imagine if you're doing this, and the police say, we're on your side. We're not going to arrest you. We'll be ordered to arrest you, but we won't do it. And if the president of the country, if Obama called the military in And the military said, we're not shooting. We're not taking you to jail. We're with you, and we're going to work with you to move this thing forward. That was the same thing happening in Ethiopia. And they actually did it. They actually got Emperor Haile Selassie deposed. This revolution with these protests and the demonstrations with the help of the military worked. And if you think about what's happening in Syria right now, imagine if there was opposition, and then there were people who want the ruler there, but if everybody worked together, they could have made a difference. And that happened in Ethiopia, except the revolution, or the spirit of the revolution, was betrayed by the military. Because once Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed, once his cabinet members were arrested, the military said, you know what? We can figure out a way to run this country. We already have an organization. We already have a hierarchy. We'll kind of take care of things, and then we'll work with you guys, talking to the students, we'll work with you guys and get a civilian government, get a constitution. So you had law students, political scientists, you had all these people working on a constitution for a civilian government, and the military turned on them. And the country became absolutely chaotic. And that was probably, those moments right there were some of my earliest memories of living in Ethiopia, of growing up there. And from my perspective, as a child, I was, 3 or 4 at the time. What I could remember as a child, but what I knew in my family was that people were starting to talk in whispers. People were not talking to me at the table the way that they were. There were members of my family that were suddenly gone, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what had happened. I couldn't play outside the way I normally would have with my friends, and there were nights when, instead of hearing our dogs howling to be fed or something, I was hearing gunfire and gun battles. And I understand now that that was between the military and students who had once been on the same side, but now the military is starting to kill off people they think are counter-revolutionary, meaning people who are your age, and those same high school and college students who thought that they were all on the same side. I remember what's been so special for me being here at the festival is this connection with photography that you have this year, because one of the only ways that I have been able to describe my own memories of living in Ethiopia at that time is through photographs. I remember my life as if it were a series of snapshots of certain moments. I can tell you about soldiers breaking into our house, and I know that they were looking for someone. And I have this image of the soldier at the door, and I'm standing by my grandfather, and we're both looking. And I have that, but I don't have anything about why that soldier came in. I don't know what happened after that. I just have that moment frozen. I have the moments of watching when bullets are shot in the air from these from the types of guns that they were using, that the bullets make a flare in the night like fire. So I remember these ribbons of fire, going through, and it's a beautiful image, but devastating when you think about what was actually happening. And I remember even back then asking my parents, well, what's going on? Where, people would be taken away from our compound, and I would see them being taken, I would see the trucks leaving, but no one would tell me what was going on. So no one, even to this day actually, my parents still have a difficult time talking. The only ways that I have been able to find out anything has been finding it on my own through research, or finding a way to trick my parents into answering a question they didn't realize that they were answering. But I had those moments. And at some point with my family, we decided, when it was starting to get really, really horrible, around 1975, my father, we were lucky enough that he worked for Ethiopian Airlines. And he said, I just have to get you guys out. And there was a moment, I remember, when he did it, my parents and I was playing outside. It was a big holiday. We, for Ethiopian New Year's, we could throw, you know those little sparklers? Those little firecracker sparklers? I was out there with the adults at night, and in Ethiopian tradition, you throw that into the air in celebration. And the gun battles started right then when we were outside. And I remember shaking so badly. I had the firecracker in my hand that it was lit, and it fell on my foot and burned me. And I ran back into the house and told my parents, and that's when my dad said, that's it. We have to get out of here. So my dad made a request, and really, we were really lucky, through Ethiopian Airlines, and we were able to just get a simple transfer to Nigeria. And so while so many other people were fleeing for their lives, we were able to do it in a relatively easy way. And we lived in Nigeria for a while, and then eventually moved to Kenya. And by that time, things had gotten progressively worse in Ethiopia. And the government, with its secret police and different agents who were, in fact, everywhere that other Ethiopians were who were not in Ethiopia, they were making life very difficult, even for those outside of the country. And it became better to make a move to the U.S. So I moved there. And just on a bit of a side note, which I think has been an interesting thing for me now, I met a bunch of Libyan students here in the U.S. I moved to Colorado, and I had never seen snow So when people told me that you're going to go somewhere where there's snow, I thought I was moving to Alaska, and every Alaskan lived in an igloo. So I was expecting that, but I moved to Colorado, and there was a little bit of sun, even though it was January, and I met these Libyan students there, and these students were fleeing Gaddafi at that time, and though no one still would explain to me what I was doing in the U.S., why was I here? Why did I leave my grandparents? I wanted to go back to Ethiopia. As much as there was a lot of trouble there. There was from Ethiopia. That's where my family was. That's where my friends were there. I still couldn't quite figure out what I was doing in this strange country with people who spoke a strange language and to me looked very strange at the time. And I met these students who talked about their own experiences in Libya. And they started telling me what was happening to their family members and what they had gone through and why they were afraid. And listening to them, I began to understand, wow, this is just like Ethiopia. They're like me. I'm not so strange, because there are people who have my own experience. And it was, I think, my first introduction to the power of storytelling, to the reasons that we share our stories. And we share them because we understand, I think, that we don't want to be the only one to have experienced certain things. And I feel like that's why some of these Libyan students were telling me this. And we listen to stories in some ways because I think we are trying to recognize ourselves in the stories that we hear. And the stories, no matter where they come from, if we sense a recognition, then we feel an impact. We tend to remember those stories the most. And these stories from these Libyans resonated with me for the rest of my life. I mean, it still does now, especially when I was watching what was happening in Libya in the last year, 2 years. I've done nothing but think about these students and wonder where they are, and I remember, and what happened in Libya rang so true to what was happening, what happened before in Ethiopia. Once I got here to the US, though, I still couldn't find a lot of information about Ethiopia. I was trying to find books, I was trying to find stories, trying to find information about children like me who had come here, children like me who had these memories that I couldn't quite make sense of yet. And I really didn't find anything, not about Ethiopia, but I started reading everything I could about China, about the cultural revolutions, about Guatemala, about, again, Cuba. I was reading about any country you could think of that had anything similar to this. I would just grab that book and read it. And I started I was reading so many fiction books about the Civil War here in the US. And in reading that, I started understanding the way that civil war, the way the conflict in one country amongst its own people can start to tear families apart. Because the same way that civil war, the North and South, was really causing a rift between families, the same thing I knew was happening and had happened in Ethiopia. And I started realizing even then that in some ways what I had witnessed in Ethiopia had also been here, that it's not just an Ethiopian occurrence, that this is a human occurrence. This is what happens when war or conflict forces you to maybe be a part of a family that you don't agree with. When your ideology is so against maybe what your parents think, or what your sister thinks, or what your brother thinks, that you may hate the way they think, but you love who they are. And what happens in that situation? What happens when you have to sit at a table and a topic comes up, and you're bound to these people by blood, but you're completely against what they espouse. And I saw that in these books about America, and I started thinking, okay, this is not so weird. This is not so strange. I'm not, again, I didn't feel like I was an anomaly, that I was weird. I was starting to find my own stories in these other stories, because they're all about human beings. They're all about, it's questions of love and loyalty. So even as I was growing up, though, my parents, if I asked my mom anything, why did these soldiers come in? Why didn't they take somebody away? I swear they took somebody away. My parents would say, no. No. How do you remember that? No. Don't talk to us anymore about that. And they wouldn't. So as I grew older, I just moved from reading fiction to reading, historical books, and trying to find political science books about Ethiopia, reading everything I could about history in Ethiopia, trying to put the pieces together of these photographs I had in my head. But I still didn't really think about being a writer. I didn't know what it took to be a writer. All I knew was that I had an interest in this history, and I liked to read. I really like to read. And I think reading in books for me was what kept me pretty sane once I got here. And as I grew older, and I majored in English when I was in college, continuing to read, continuing to try to find my own story and my own specific story, and I wasn't finding it. And years passed, and I just had this thought in my head of, gosh, I wonder if one day I could maybe do something, but I still had no idea what it meant to be a writer and what it takes to be a writer, and what right did I have to call myself a writer if I'm writing essays, but that's nothing, for school. And there was a moment when I was living in Los Angeles, and it was a Sunday morning, and I had just gotten the LA Times, and I happened to open the paper, and quite literally the first thing I opened to was a big spread, a big feature of the 25th anniversary of the fall of the military junta in Argentina, the Dirty Wars. And the journalist had taken the approach of going to Argentina, finding a group of former high school students who were juniors and seniors at the time of the military junta. He had a class picture, those class pictures that all of you guys take at some point during the year. He had that. And he had found out from this class picture that more than half of these high school students had been executed by the military junta, or they were disappeared, meaning no one knew what happened to them. And he went back and said, well, what happened to the others? Where are they now, 25 years later? And the feature was tracking these survivors, writing down the memories of their friends, their classmates, their teacher, and also talking to the mothers. And the photographs were what struck me the most, because these mothers were holding up the what do you call it, the school pictures that you guys take, senior pictures. Well, these mothers were holding them up of their disappeared sons and daughters. And I saw that and I said, I've seen these mothers in Ethiopia holding up these same photographs of their sons and daughters. I've seen these pictures of 17 and 18-year-olds who have suddenly disappeared from the world and no one knows where they are. And this journalist had taken what is a huge event and narrowed it down to one mother and a child, or a family, or just one class of students. And I said, maybe I could do something like this with my book. I'm not a political scientist. I am not a journalist. I'm not a historian. But maybe I can talk about one family. And I can talk about that because we can all relate to family. And I wasn't quite sure if I could, but I started applying to graduate schools. I got into NYU, and I went with this idea to try to make a book from this story. Not quite sure yet what it would mean. And I was also, when I got there, about how do you make something this horrible into fiction? How do you take a catastrophe of an entire nation and really just make a story up about it? Don't people who have died deserve something that might be actually true? And I luckily, again, this was just I can't believe the way sometimes things have fallen into place. I had as my first professor at NYU a South African poet by the name of Puterbaugh. And he's a white South African, and he had been involved in anti-apartheid movements and organizations when he lived in South Africa. He had been caught by the apartheid government and then put on death row for 5 years in South Africa. He was my professor at New York University. And I talked to him about my hesitation with doing a book of fiction about this. And I said, Brayton, why can't, can I do fiction about this kind of story, about a war story, about a story where almost 500,000 people died? What right do I have? And he said something to me that has stayed with me, and it will for the rest of my life. That sometimes fiction tells a truth that history cannot. And he said, if you get us to know a family, if you get us to understand one person's trouble, that's going to say a lot more than any statistic or any historical or textbook ever could. And he encouraged me for the remaining years that I was at school, and I continued to write the book that I think some of you have read, which became Beneath the Lion's Gaze. So I'm completely indebted to him and so many of the people in my life who have helped. One of the things that I have thought about a lot is what does it take to actually stand up to a group of men who are pointing guns at you, and you know that they will shoot if you cross a line. And what does it take to continue to step forward into those guns? Because that's what people that were your age were doing in Ethiopia. They were risking their lives. And I'm looking out here at all your faces, and if I were to count every 2 or every 3 and ask you to leave the room, that's how many were killed, sometimes in a week. And the rest of you who would be here would continue to go out and protest and demonstrate and fight with your parents and argue with your other brothers or sisters and continue to do this. And it's been the question that I've asked myself about what does it mean to be brave? We have all these different definitions, and we have these movies of superheroes, and I love X-Men. We have these where they seem to go out, but when it's you and it's just you, and if you have a choice about walking out that door or sitting down and saying nothing, sometimes it's so much easier to play it safe. But we had an entire country, and we do now, if you think of Syria, an entire country of people who are continuing to say, I will risk everything. And so as I was writing this book, I started wondering about this, what gave people this courage, not just courage, but this continued belief that they could make a difference and their life was worth the risk of other people having a better future than them. And I'll speak about that a little more in the Q&A section, but I do want to read for you a section of Mickey, who's one of my characters, who was a poor boy living in Ethiopia who joined the military, thinking that he was going to make a difference in a good way. Also joining because the military paid. And he didn't have the resources of my other characters, like Dawit and Jonas, who had a well-to-do father and didn't have to do that, who could go to school. But Mickey at one point really did believe that he was doing something good by joining what would become a monstrous beast in Ethiopia. And I want to read for you a letter that he wrote to his friend Dawit, who was also a revolutionary. And Mickey is writing, he's been sent to an area that has been famine-stricken. People were just starting to find out about the famine at that time in Ethiopia. And they were absolutely horrified and shocked that Emperor Haile Selassie had let things get this bad. And it was one of the reasons that the revolution took off so quickly. And so Mickey has been sent to this area to investigate what's happening and write a report for the military so that the military, this is in the early days, could produce this report to the students and university professors, and there would be some publicity about what's actually been going on in the country. So Mickey now is writing a letter to Dawit, his friend, about what he has seen. Back in his tent that cold night, shivering under the pale yellow glow of a weak kerosene lamp, Mickey wrote with urgency and anger, scribbling his words onto the blank paper. This is how a man tills his land, behind cattle that are tied to one end of a plow that he uses to dig and lift and turn the ground. He holds a stick in one hand and the end of the plow in the other. At the end of that stick is a rope that he uses to whip the animals when they tire from the hot sun and the lack of water and simple hunger. A man works like this every day, every month, year after year, behind his cattle, his hand attached to a plow that has dug its own imprints into his calloused palms. He speaks to no one but himself. He hears nothing but his own slavish grunts as he pushes his plow into dirt, willing a crop to grow from unforgiving ground, praying daily for more rain. But it didn't rain in 1972 in the north, my friend, and the farmer had no crops. The rains did not come as they should, and when the rains failed, the crops failed. And when the crops failed, the farmer grew hungry. And when he grew hungry, his cattle also grew hungry, because a farmer will feed his cattle before himself. When the cattle began to die, the farmer gathered his family and tried to walk to the nearest village, the nearest aid shelter, the nearest anywhere where he could hold out his proud hand and beg for food. But everywhere he went was the same as what he had left. They are starving here in Wallo, Dawit. They are starving in Tigray and Shoa. We have lived in the city and we have forgotten about these people. And imagine now a farmer far from Wallo in the south, where the rains are more forgiving and the land has not been cursed by famine. This farmer plows land that isn't his, that was never his father's, which was never his grandfather's, and will never be his son's. He works as hard as his animals day after day to pay a landowner's taxes and to glean enough crops so his family has enough grains for food after they've given the landowner his share. The landowner's share is always large. It is always more than the landowner needs. It is a selfish share created by a selfish system that preys on the weak and makes them servants to the rich. Dawit, we live in a feudal country. Our country exploits those who work the hardest to stay alive. Our emperor has built the myth of this land on the blood of those who have been too tired to voice their own truths. Is this my country? We have grown up together, Dawit, but I was someone else before you knew me. My father was this farmer from the south. He died on a rich man's plot of land, tied to the wrong end of his plow, because he'd been forced to sell his cattle to feed his family that harvest. My father died like an animal, still tied to those ropes when I found him, swallowing with his last breaths the dust of another man's land, broken by the burden of his labor. The rich think this land is theirs, though they have never earned the right to call it theirs, not like these farmers, not like my father. Most of those who are here on the ground dying are the ones who were strong enough to walk out of their villages and get here. The bodies are littered with our people who died on the way. The roads are littered with our people who have died on the way, their bodies rotting in the sun if the vultures haven't gotten to them first. We dishonor our dead and our workers, Dawit. The rich have kept their secret. The emperor has stolen this truth from us, and we have to fight to get our country back and save these people. A man told me today as many as 200,000 will die. They will die. It is too late for them. Do we even have as many alive in Addis Ababa? And so Mickey's letter to Dawit galvanizes him to continue fighting, to continue to be on the front lines of those protests and the demonstrations, to risk his life to do this, and in a way risk his own family's life to do that. Because if the government, if this military who has now begun to turn against the students, if they find these students and catch them, a lot of times they would go right to the family and maybe arrest the mothers or arrest sisters or arrest fathers, and it would affect the entire family. But Dawit continued to do this. And as the revolution escalates and as it continues to get bloody, he moves into an underground resistance group that becomes a more organized fight against this new military government that has now become almost a dictatorship. And what the military has started to do to send messages to students, to people like Dawit, is leave the bodies of their compatriots, of their friends, of their students, leave the bodies that they have killed and tortured on the roadside, in certain neighborhoods, in front of high schools, in front of colleges, to scare the rest of the people. And so Dawit has to consider, what does it mean to resist? What does it mean to fight? He has a hard time with thinking about the idea of picking up a gun and shooting it. He is not quite ready to do that, though Dawit does eventually change. So one of the first things he thinks of, his act of resistance, instead of killing, is to pick up the bodies of those dead that are left, to find a way to get them back to their families, which again is illegal at that time and could land him in jail and be killed. But for Dawit, that's what he wants to do. So he recruits his sister-in-law, Sarah, to do this with him, to break curfew, to go out into these roads, collect the bodies, find another friend who could identify and tell the families that they now have an opportunity to bury their children. The families weren't allowed to bury them or mourn for their dead. I'd like to read you a section of Dawit beginning to collect the bodies. Along the way in this story, his father, who is a medical doctor, has been forced to take care of a torture victim so that she can go back into custody once she heals. And his father, Dawit's father, Hailu, has been quite conflicted about that order. He makes a decision, his own decision, about what to do with this patient, and that decision lands him in jail. So Dawit is collecting these bodies and thinking of his father who is in jail. Dawit's not quite sure if his father is alive or if he will be one of the bodies that he finds on the road. But I will read you now a section of Dawit. One day he would tell his father this, that the eyes die first, that we make our way to dust and ash blindly. Dawit would tell him of the night he learned of this, the night they found the still-breathing woman by the road, her broken bones and open wounds covered in grass and dirt. Sarah had taken a blanket from the car to cover her, her face grim and pained. But the woman's eyelids had fluttered, then widened, and Dawit had watched her breath leave her body through her eyes. He'd stared, stunned, as a cloudy film covered them and seemed to travel through the length of her, stiffening everything in its course. He'd sat for longer than he should have, peering into her flat gaze and dilated pupils, fascinated by how terror fell away from her face and left only a gaping mouth. One day he would ask his father if he knew that death shows no mercy on a fighting body, that those who struggle suffer rigor mortis more quickly than those who lie submissive and let death creep slowly. He would tell Hailu that this vengeful rigidity lasts no more than 2 days, that the body's eternal desire for motion eventually takes control again and limbs become pliant. He would tell him everything. He would even confess, never letting go of his father's hand, that a stiff body could be broken, unsnapped from its rigidity by the simple will and exertion of his youngest son, then reshaped to fit in the back of a Volkswagen, already full of the smell of decay. The bodies were easy to find, sloppily discarded by the road just beyond the new jail, dumped from roaring trucks in the first hours of dawn. Dawit, Sarah, and Malaku worked tirelessly in the lull of soldiers' shift changes and mealtimes. Dawit lifted the corpses. Sarah helped drag them into the car. Then both of them drove past homes into the hills, then to a dense patch of trees and shrub, to a hut where Malaku waited to let memory guide him towards recognition. They discovered that soldiers who patrolled the area were inexperienced and lazy, that the colonel kept the best in his jail, monitoring his private collection of prisoners. They learned that bodies left alone for 1 day raised less suspicion than those they picked up immediately. And as family after family, from neighborhood after neighborhood and neighborhoods beyond theirs, began to gather at Malaku's kiosk at dawn, desperate for news of their missing, they realized that they were not enough and would never be enough to rid the roads of this latest blasphemy. Dawit begins to question what it means to be brave as the revolution continues. He's forced to question his own ideas about loyalty as he's confronted with Mickey, who moves up in the ranks of the military and who soon moves from becoming his closest friend to his worst enemy. And Hailu, who is in prison, thinking about the decisions that he's made, has to consider who he is, whether he is a man first or a doctor, whether his role is to heal first or to try to keep his family alive. And all these things have been, for me, consuming questions in my life about good people who do bad things and bad people who have moments of redemption. Conflict and war, even simple, basic family tensions or tensions with friends in high school or our teachers force all of us into these types of situations, force all of us to consider what we should do or shouldn't do and what that makes us as human beings and as people, and if it's a betrayal of who we think we are or not. So as I